This is a shooting, not a border operation, because what you're about to hear isn't a rumor, and it isn't a partisan argument. It's sworn testimony describing what life looks like when federal agents open fire on ordinary people in broad daylight. One woman was simply driving to church to donate clothes. She says, "I felt bullets continue to pierce my body." Another victim, a 30-year-old Montessori teacher, ended up with 7 bullet holes and was still dragged out of hospital custody within 3 hours. And here's the contradiction. None of them were fugitives. None of them were charged with a crime. Some were never even asked for ID. So ask yourself this: if a normal Saturday morning can turn into gunfire and shattered glass, what does safety even mean anymore? But here's the part nobody is saying out loud. If this can happen to them, how far are we from it happening to you? What's happening here isn't one isolated incident, because the moment you hear these testimonies back to back, a pattern starts to form, and it's bigger than any single street corner in Chicago or Minneapolis. The hearing opens with a blunt framing. These are stories of life in Donald Trump's America and stories about death. That's not commentary. That is how the witnesses themselves are setting the scene. And then you get the core event, not in full, but in fragments that are almost worse. A Border Patrol vehicle stops just 1 to 2 car lengths ahead. A woman says time froze because she'd watched another encounter weeks earlier. Agent killing Silverio Villegas Gonzalez just 3 weeks prior. Think about that for a second. She didn't panic because she was guilty. She panicked because she believed she was in danger. And that raises the real question. When people see federal vehicles and their first instinct is not compliance but survival, what does that signal about the system we're living under? Now watch how fast this escalates, because the next detail flips the entire story. The claim being made is simple and it's explosive. That's that this wasn't enforcement. It was violence without justification. And the testimony hits like a punch because it's not vague, it's painfully specific. Miramar Martinez describes agents jumping out, pointed his gun at me. She says she tried to get away, struck the curb, and then came the moment everything changed. I felt a burning sensation. I had been shot by pepper balls. But it didn't stop there. As I continued to drive, she says, my back passenger window shattered, and I felt bullets continue to pierce my body. Read that again. Not a warning shot, not a single mistake. Multiple rounds entering arms, legs, chest. She later says, I realized I'd been shot multiple times. And here's what's missing, the part that should make you pause. Where is the crime? Where is the threat that justifies 7 gunshot wounds? Notice what they didn't deny, because when the charges vanish later, it raises a terrifying possibility. Were the bullets the point? This is where the story flips. The situation doesn't just intensify, it normalizes, because after the street comes the hospital, and what happens next is almost harder to process than the shooting itself. Martinez manages to drive a mile away, collapses into a mechanic's shop, calls 911 and says, Border Patrol agents had just shot me and I needed help. She's bleeding, lightheaded, losing consciousness. Then she wakes up in hospital, and she remembers multiple agents standing around watching me be treated on camera. In that room, her arms, legs, chest wrapped in bandages, 7 bullet holes, and then in less than 3 hours, she says she was discharged straight into federal custody. Think about the precedent that sets. In a normal society, a wounded civilian is protected. Here, the testimony describes agents rushing the nurses to finish up so they could take me with them. But here's the part nobody is saying out loud. Dragging a bleeding woman out of hospital is not an accident. It's a signal, a system showing it can reach you anywhere, even on a stretcher. And once that becomes normal, the next step is obvious, because the story doesn't end with survival. It escalates into something even darker. The next proof hit is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore, because the government didn't just shoot her, it tried to rewrite what happened. While she's in custody, still wounded, she hears the story being told about her on the news. She says she was being called a domestic terrorist. The allegation that she rammed federal agents. But listen to the detail that destroys that narrative. She says, if they only knew I was a month away from paying off my truck, I would never intentionally damage my vehicle. And then she reminds the room who she actually is. On Friday, I was teaching the young children at the Montessori school, singing and dancing, preparing for spooky season. On Saturday, My own government was calling me a domestic terrorist. This is where the viewer's brain snaps into focus, because the distance between teacher and terrorist is now one headline, one accusation, one burst of gunfire. And here's the line that permanently changes how you see it. They tried to murder her, but never charged her with a crime. Notice what that means. The violence came first. The justification came later, and then disappeared. Now watch how fast the next layer forms. And then the story stacks into a mini crisis, rapid, chaotic, out of control, because it isn't just the shooting, it's what happens after. In court, Trump's prosecutors want Martinez held indefinitely, awaiting trial. But the judge looks out and sees something unexpected. A courtroom full of parents from the school where she teaches. The evidence is heard. And he immediately released her. So the state fires bullets, calls her a terrorist, tries to lock her away, and then the case collapses. But here's where it gets stranger. One agent, Charles Exum, doesn't leave the vehicle at the scene. He drives it from Chicago to Maine, across the entire country, the very car he claims she tried to ram. The testimony suggests the obvious implication. There must have been absolutely no damage on that car, because if the vehicle showed no impact, the entire justification falls apart. And then the final pressure point, the charges are dropped. No crime, no trial, no explanation, just blood, bullets, and silence. What happens if this continues? Because the next witness shows this wasn't a one-off. It was a pattern moving city to city. Now the story shifts, and it shifts straight onto you, because the next victim isn't framed as a suspect or even as someone running. He's framed as someone simply existing in the wrong moment. My name is Ali Rahman, the witness says. I am a resident of South Minneapolis. He tells them he is a disabled person with autism and a traumatic brain injury. And then comes the detail that makes this painfully real. On January 13th, he was on the way to his 39th appointment at a traumatic brain injury center. Not a protest, not a confrontation, a medical visit. He encounters a traffic jam caused by ICE vehicles and no signs indicating how to get around it. Then the first instruction he hears isn't calm, it's a threat. Move, I will break your effing window. Agents surround his car, shouting conflicting threats and instructions that he says he could not process, and then the glass flew across my face. If this feels familiar, say so in the comments, because this is what it looks like when ordinary life becomes a trigger point. And the next detail is where the story turns terrifying. What makes this systemic isn't just the violence, it's the mechanism underneath it. Because Ali Rahman describes something deeper than an arrest. He describes a machine that doesn't slow down for context, disability, or humanity. He says, I yelled, I'm disabled. And an agent said, too late, too late. That phrase alone explains the system. Once the escalation begins, nothing stops it. He remembers patterns, not ideology, not politics, patterns of people killed in similar moments. He thinks of Genoa Donald, killed by police during a traffic stop. He thinks of Mr. Silverio Gonzalez, killed by ICE in his vehicle last year. Then comes the most cinematic, unsettling image in the testimony. An agent pulled a large combat knife in front of my face. He thought it was for cutting him. Later, he learns it was to cut his seatbelt. But in that moment, fear fills the gap. That's the mechanism. Speed, confusion, intimidation, and the assumption that force comes first. Here's why that detail changes everything. A system like this doesn't need guilt. It only needs momentum. And the trajectory from here is already forming. Now we're at the near future edge of this story, where it stops being about two individuals and starts becoming about what comes next. Because the testimony leaves us with two possible paths forward. One path is accountability. The fact that charges were dropped against Miramar Martinez matters. The fact that a judge immediately released her matters. Those are moments where the system hesitates, where the public record doesn't match the narrative, where the violence can't be neatly justified. But the other path is darker, and it's driven by inertia. Rahman says he was never asked for ID, never told I was under arrest, never read my rights, and never charged with a crime. That is not a procedural error. That is a warning sign. Because if force becomes normal before explanation, then the threshold for using it keeps lowering. Today, it's traffic jams. Tomorrow, it's routine stops. And the question becomes, how many times can this happen before it stops shocking anyone? But here's the part nobody is saying out loud. The next move isn't theoretical. It's already forming in the gap between testimony and consequence. And once that gap becomes permanent, the story changes forever. There's one insight that ties all of this together, and it's the part that lingers. These stories aren't just about shootings. They're about the collapse of the boundary between enforcement and punishment, between accusation and evidence, between public safety and public fear. Miramar Martinez says she was shot, left bleeding, branded a terrorist, and then watched as the charges disappeared. Ali Rahman says he was dragged out of his car, injured, never even told why, and never charged with a crime. So the deep reframing is this: when the state can harm first and explain later, or not at all, the real target isn't just the person in front of the gun. It's the expectation that you are safe by default. This is where the story flips into something bigger than politics. It becomes about power, momentum, and what happens when ordinary life becomes a contact zone. And the reason to stay with this story isn't because it ends here. It doesn't. Because the next layer is already waiting. What happens after testimony, after headlines fade, after the cameras leave? If you want continued analysis as this unfolds, follow and subscribe. Because the question isn't whether this happened. The question is what happens next.